As a church, we are growing up in strength and maturity. But with that, we also have a very specific identity. And I think we run the risk with that identity we can become embedded. And we can start looking to our body of believers, our specific body of believers, for our spiritual identity. And we can kind of lose sight of what it is that God has called us to in our lives individually and what He's given us to do. And this is something that I've just realized over the last 5 years, but kind of slowly, and the revelation didn't come until recently, that there was a slight twist in my understanding of what church should be. I look at this church, and this church has become so much more than I ever could have anticipated, with the small groups and the ministries and the community houses. And I think those have all been an incredible blessing. And but over the last 5 years, we've been living in a challenging neighborhood, and I know I've talked about that in the past. And over the 5 years, I've wondered what God wanted to do with our neighborhood. And I've vacillated between problem solving and blaming. Who could I blame for the problems in our neighborhood? And where I finally rested most recently was I wanted to blame the churches for not doing anything in North Minneapolis. I see the buildings, but I don't see the people. Where are the people? And secretly or privately or quietly, what I always wanted was for God to put a calling on the salvage yard, to go to North Minneapolis so that something could be done. And I've just been so frustrated with the church because they just seem so impotent in our neighborhood and watching, death and crime and stuff like that. And then came the harsh realization that God did call the salvage yard to North Minneapolis, because in His wisdom, He called me there. He called Mike there. He called Aaron and Eli there. He called Heather there. And the people that have been living in Heather's house, He's called each of those people there. And if there are other people here from North Minneapolis, then you can talk to us afterwards. But He's called you there. But as I look around this room, there are people from all different areas of the cities, from all different neighborhoods. And He's called you to where you are right now. And I wonder, there needs to be a salvage yard stamp wherever there are salvage yard people. We have each been called to be ambassadors to our neighborhoods. And the second thing that this table represents to me is abundance. The abundance we have, the abundance we enjoy as a result of Jesus' sacrifice for us. We all have that abundance. And with that abundance, we could see the gospel bleeding into our neighborhoods. And I'm not talking about additional activities or ministries or whatever, but just a slight change in how we live our lives. It doesn't have to be spectacular. It just has to be loving. And when we begin to love, when we begin to see just small opportunities to love our neighbors, we give God access to our city. And when we give God access to our city, I believe with everything in me, because we've seen it in the past, that God will do something that appears spontaneous, but it's what He's been wanting all along. I believe that we will see an explosion. I believe that we could see an outpouring of God's power in this city like we have never seen before. But it's up to each one of us just to pray and ask God for possibilities to see things in just a little bit of a different way. That we can begin to show love to the people who are lost around us. And I wasn't gonna, share this story, and I hope I don't screw up the details. But someone in our congregation just does a little gardening out in her front yard. That's all she does, just a little bit of gardening. And there was a little silly exchange between her and someone who works in the neighborhood. And just that little exchange, just that little openness, just that little room for possibility, just that little bit of space for God to move. And this woman showed up at their house the next week with a friend, and they were invited in. They don't know Jesus, and yet they were invited in to a feast, and they sat at the head of the table. And this was God's love. And if we're doing things like this, if we're just adjusting our lives in just the smallest way so that God's love can be fleshed out through our activities, through our lives, I think we're going to see something that God's been wanting all along. So tonight, as we celebrate communion, let us remember the unity that we have with each other. And let us remember the abundance that we have been given because of what Jesus has done. For believers, this table is for you. So come and enjoy and celebrate. And if you are a believer but have not been walking with God the way you should, then I just ask that you would take time to pray. We're going to have some time for prayer. Take time to pray and get your life right with God. And then come and enjoy restoration, because this table is about being restored to God through Jesus Christ, and it's about being restored to the body. And finally, if you're not a believer, this table is not for you. But since you're here and we're going to have some time, then could you just take some time and just talk to God? And we'll have people available and for prayer. If you need prayer for anything, just come on forward. So with that, for I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way he took the cup also, after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes."